Good evening. We have been holding up a bit because a great many more people are expected, but I think the weather has delayed them, and I know some of you are on schedule, so we will begin, and we'll try to overlook disturbance as people come in late. I'm Ed Gallagher. I'm president of the American Scandinavian Foundation. It's my very, very great pleasure to welcome you to Scandinavia House tonight for the first of many previews of Luminous Modernism, Scandinavian Art Comes to America 1912. This exhibition is the final exhibition of three which have been planned and presented by the American Scandinavian Foundation in celebration of our centennial year. Luminous Modernism looks back to the first exhibition ever sponsored by the ASF, the 1912 Scandinavian Art Exhibition. That exhibition, which opened in New York on December 10th, 1912, and traveled to 4 other American cities, was an ambitious undertaking composed of 165 works of art by 45 artists from Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. The introductory note in the exhibition catalog refers to the Foundation's intention to advance the knowledge of Scandinavian culture and the American public. And it further remarks that it is one of the few occasions in the history of Scandinavian art that the three countries have united in exhibiting. The effects of that exhibition were far-reaching, influencing our emerging modernist movements and expanding the American perception of Scandinavian contemporary culture. Directly in keeping with the mission of the American Scandinavian Foundation, its founders intended it to further understanding and appreciation of Scandinavian culture in America and American culture in the Nordic countries. Luminous Modernism, Scandinavian Art Comes to America 1912 is a retrospective look at the 1912 exhibition. It is intended to reintroduce Americans to the Nordic art of the turn of the century, a period of great vitality and creative energy, as well as to increase sensitivity to the individual national identities. There are a great many people and institutions have joined together to make this exhibition possible. Some of you are in this room, some are on their way. Some will be arriving in the next few days. But right now I'd like to mention a few who I think are particularly outstanding. First of all, the exhibition received generous financial support from a number of individuals and organizations, most especially William B. and Ingrid Gunderson Ginsburg, who made an enormously generous grant in support of all of our centennial exhibitions. We also thank very heartily the Barbara Osher Pro Suecia Foundation, which has been a particularly strong supporter of programming at Scandinavia House since its opening 11 years ago. We also thank all donors to the ASF Centennial Fund, and we offer a very special thanks to SAS Scandinavian Airlines, which is the official airline of the ASF Centennial and which has provided all transportation for this exhibition. Additional support has been generously provided by the consulates of Denmark, Finland, Norway, and Sweden. More than anyone else, I think, though, we should be thanking those individuals and institutions who have lent works to the exhibition. Most notably, I want to express our deep gratitude to Ambassador John L. Loeb, Jr., who has built the largest and most important collection of Danish art outside of Denmark. We're very fortunate to include a number of works from that collection in this exhibition. It is an extraordinary collection, and we are most grateful to him. I also want to particularly thank our trustee Monica Heimbold and Ambassador Charles Heimbold, as well as David and Susan Werner, Werner Amels and the Amels Gallery, Peter and Renata Nahum, and anonymous lenders from the United States and Europe. The exhibition has also been enriched by the generosity and cooperation of many institutional lenders, and I will quickly just read a list of them, including the National Gallery of Denmark, the Museum of Decorative Arts and Design in Copenhagen, the Helsinki Art Museum, the National Gallery of Iceland, the National Museum of Art, Architecture and Design, represented here by Frode Ernst Haberkamp, the Bergen Art Museum, the Dramens Museum, in Sweden, the Prince Eugene's Valdemarsudde, represented, I believe she's here, by Elisabeth Wilander Berggren, and the Zorn Museum. Last but certainly not least, we are very grateful to the Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who lent a wonderful Munch that was in the original exhibition. I want to just briefly also thank all of the ASF team that worked closely with Dr. Berman, including Parry Stave, Exhibition Coordinator, and Colleen Leth, Exhibition Associate, as well as our staff members Lynn Carter, Kyle Reinhardt, Ari Tiziani, Linda Seldy, Victoria McGann, and Claire Whitman. We also acknowledge with great appreciation the hard work and great ability of Snap Publications, Sarah King and Joseph Guglietti, who produced a very beautiful catalog which is available upstairs. Above all, and that's quite a list, I would like to thank Pat Berman for taking on this position of this project and for her distinguished scholarship, her energy, and her collegiality. Pat has had a long history with the American Scandinavian Foundation, beginning in 1982 when she was a research associate on the landmark exhibition Northern Light, which was sponsored by the ASF and curated by Kirk Varnadoe. That exhibition, I think, is still remembered fondly by anybody who is interested in Scandinavian or indeed European painting. 2 years after that exhibition, the ASF awarded Pat her first fellowship, which she used to travel to Norway. 2 years later, she received another fellowship, and that began a career which has truly been brilliant. Pat is a leading specialist in early modern Scandinavian art and a professor of art history at Wellesley College and University of Oslo's Institute for Philosophy, the History of Ideas, Art History, and Classical Studies. It's quite a department. She has also, I believe, just assumed a position as the head of the advisory committee at the Munch Museum in Oslo. She has curated or co-curated numerous exhibitions, including most recently, and I will use the American title, In Munch's Laboratory, The Road to the Festival Hall, and that was just opened at the University of Oslo as part of their bicentennial celebration. She, earlier in her career, also, as I mentioned, worked on Northern Light, Realism and Symbolism in Scandinavian Painting, as well as a number of other exhibitions. She is the author of many books and essays, and is currently at work on the book Edvard Munch, Fashioning the Self, as well as, Fashioning the Self and the Nation. She has received numerous awards and fellowships, including the Anna and Samuel Penarski Teaching Prize, Wellesley College, and the Fulbright Award, as well as, of course, the American Philosophical Society Fellowship in 2008 and the ASF Award. She received her BA from Hampshire College and is her MA and PhD from the New York University Institute of Fine Arts. I could go on and on and on, but I think we're more eager to hear from Pat Berman, so Pat, take the podium, please. Thank you.
Good evening. I'm testing the microphone. Is it working? And can you hear me in the back? Excellent. Thank you very much. Well, it's an honor to be speaking with you about this exhibition, Luminous Modernism. And I know that you're all anxious to actually see the exhibition and to see the works in the exhibition. But I would like to tell you a few backstories before we go upstairs to look at the paintings. First of all, I want to thank the American Scandinavian Foundation for hosting this exhibition. And I stand here as an individual speaking to you, but I'm actually representing a whole team of researchers and specialists who were involved in this exhibition. And before I get started, I want to say that there were specialists in each of the 5 Nordic countries who selected works for us to include in the exhibition and who helped to facilitate the loans. And my job was merely to sort of gather and organize the efforts of quite a few people. A few of them are in the room, and Ed has made his thanks. And in preparing the exhibition catalog, I also worked with a team of scholars to do the writing and to do the research. So again, I'm speaking, but I'm speaking here, I hope, well enough for many who are here as well. This exhibition, Luminous Modernism, looks back, as Edward Gallagher said, to an exhibition that was organized by the American Scandinavian Society and sponsored by the American Scandinavian Foundation in 1912, one of the first big acts of the American Scandinavian Foundation. It was a leap of faith to do this exhibition, which, as Ed Gallagher has said, included 165 works of painting, sculpture, tapestry, and functional arts that was collected from all over Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, transported here to New York, and this is one of the posters announcing the exhibition in 1912. And then the exhibition traveled from New York City to Buffalo, Toledo, Chicago, and Boston. Everywhere the exhibition went, it garnered remarkable praise from critics. It had an enormous critical profile, and we know that about 69,000 people visited this exhibition across these 5 cities, which in 1912 made it a kind of a blockbuster show. These are installation shots from the Albright Gallery in Buffalo, where the exhibition traveled. As I said, wherever the exhibition traveled, it garnered remarkable praise, and it became a bit of a phenomenon. And when you go up into the gallery upstairs, you'll see these photographs again. They contain within them some of the works that are in our current exhibition as well. Among the other benefits of this exhibition in 1912 was the fact that it was the first time that Edvard Munch's paintings were exhibited in North America. And I'm showing you Edvard Munch's self-portrait with cigarette, which was in the original exhibition, and which wasn't able to travel here. There's a huge Munch retrospective right now in Paris. So some of the paintings that were in our exhibition in 1912 are currently in Paris, but we have 3 spectacular Munchs in the current exhibition. The exhibition received a vast amount of critical writing in 1912 to 1913 as it traveled, and in the critical press, the Scandinavian painters were both praised and degraded for their radicalism. They were seen as the most outré of artists to the American public and the American critics. The colors that they used were outside of the norm. The figural distortions that they exercised in their paintings were seen as bizarre and sometimes as dangerous. And in particular, the Norwegians were called the wild men of the North by the critics. But other critics saw in this work a kind of a psychological reality. Others thought the works were not as radical as other works that they'd seen. There was a great deal of critical debate. And I'm just giving you some headline news. A Chicago critic noted that this exhibition continues to be the sensation of the hour. These Northern moderns have a certain psychological truths to impart. In Buffalo, a critic wrote, possibly no exhibition of foreign art has ever held at the Albright Gallery has attracted more attention. In Toledo, it's the most important collection of pictures shown in the Toledo Museum of Art since the inaugural. And in Boston, there was noted an exceptional attendance attributed to the presence of the Scandinavian exhibition. The star was certainly rising for Scandinavian art in 1912 to 1913. It was a phenomenon, and artists and critics flocked to see the exhibition. And then there was silence. There was silence because 2 months after this exhibition opened here in Manhattan, the doors opened to the Armory exhibition, the International Exhibition of Modern Art, in the 69th Regiment Armory. And of course, the Armory exhibition, and this is an installation shot from it, is one of the great storied moments in American art history. Prior to the Armory exhibition, of course, there were many exhibitions of European paintings that had come through New York and had traveled around the United States. Collections of German work and Spanish work and French work. And indeed, many of the exhibitions that had traveled through were organized by national schools. But most of them were of earlier 19th century European painting, or maybe the most radical work that had been seen traveling through was Impressionism. The Scandinavian show pushed the envelope for the American audiences until the Armory show opened with its 1,300 works of art by Picasso and Matisse and Brancusi. And then, of course, most famously, Marcel Duchamp's nude Descending a Staircase #2 from 1912 was exhibited in the Armory show and parodied in the press as the rude descending the staircase, or as a bunch of roof tiles that looked like they'd fallen down. But this was the moment when the Armory show arrived here, when Cubism and Cubofuturism and various stripes of post-impressionism made a gigantic appearance on American shores. And so the Scandinavian exhibition from 1912 silently slid into history. Nonetheless, it had a lasting impact. And it's for that reason that we wanted to resurrect that exhibition now in the American Scandinavian Foundation's centennial year, to look back and to honor the fact that this foundation organized a show that actually did have an impact on American culture. So the 1912 exhibition is as much a part of American art history as it was the Scandinavian dispersal of art into the larger world. One of the groups that was strongly affected by and interested in the 1912 exhibition was Alfred Stieglitz's circle. And this is a photograph of Alfred Stieglitz and some of his colleagues. Stieglitz was, of course, one of America's preeminent fine arts photographers. He was one of the founders of the pictorialist photography movement in the United States and internationally. He published an important journal of photography and of radical literature and the arts entitled Camera Work, and there's a cover of that journal over on the left. And he organized and ran a little gallery at 291 Fifth Avenue, which was nicknamed Gallery 291, and I'm showing you a view of that gallery here. And the reason I'm digressing from the Scandinavian exhibition of 1912 into the world of Alfred Stieglitz, the gallerist, the entrepreneur, the photographer, and the theorist, was that around 1912, Stieglitz and his circle were intent upon trying to articulate and trying to invent a new American tradition. Stieglitz was interested in the fact and concerned about the fact that many artists in the United States weren't fully acknowledging their own culture, American material culture, American landscapes. And many Americans were trying to sort of just emulate the works of French artists or the avant-garde works of German artists, which Stieglitz himself had brought into New York to extend to the American audience. Stieglitz and his circle were seeking, as many of them have said in their letters, their correspondence to one another, seeking a new kind of sincerity in American art. They were seeking a kind of pictorial radicalism, avant-garde painting, but that was about here and about now, rather than being about Europe. And because Stieglitz was one of the most important tastemakers in New York and nationally in these years and the years that followed, it's worth noting that it was from within Stieglitz's circle that some of the most important criticism of the 1912 Scandinavian show was published. And I'm showing you here briefly the cover of a book, a small little book entitled Is It Art? By an artist and critic named J. Nilsen Laurvik. Laurvik wrote some of the most penetrating criticism of the 1912 Scandinavian exhibition, and in his little book, Is It Art?, he reviewed the Armory show, these 1,300 radical works by Picasso and Duchamp and others. In this book, Is It Art?, Laurvik argued that art stems from the soul of a people. It's a kind of a theory, of biological or almost Darwinian theory of artistic production, which is very popular in the early part of the 20th century. The best art emerges from the soul of a people, he wrote. And authentic art, excellent art, good art, soulful art, can only be created by those who are sincere in their production. And he went on to argue that many of the radical artists in the Armory exhibition, such as the Italian futurists, were sincere producers, were radical producers, and produced from within their culture. And no matter what kinds of liberties they took with painting, no matter what kinds of distortions they used, it was all because it was embedded within them. It was primitive in them, as he wrote. And he went forward in his little book, and he argued, for example, that Marcel Duchamp was not terribly sincere because he was emulating other artists' work when he was making his Cubo-futurist paintings. And then he compared these artists in the Armory show to the Norwegians. He said there had just been a show in New York, sponsored by the American Scandinavian Foundation. He said there had just been a show in New York that had the most sincere, the most primitive, the most beautiful and meaningful and soulful art that had come to the American shores. And he used that as a measure against which to see any other kind of modern art. So this was the way that some members of the Stieglitz circle were seeing this little 1912 exhibition that disappeared from the American stage. The exhibition was not only important to American critics and members of the Stieglitz circle, but such artists as Marsden Hartley, who we know viewed the catalog and became interested in it and interested in Scandinavian art, years later returned to landscape painting that was invested in some of the works that he had seen there. The works that he'd seen in this 1912 show, and this is a landscape by Hartley from 1930, the works that he'd seen in this show for him already confirmed a direction that he himself was taking in his American landscape paintings. The Arthur Wesley Dow, the great pedagogue, the great teacher in Rockport, Massachusetts, in the Gloucester School of Artists, and a producer of tonal woodcuts, for example. His circle in Gloucester became enamored of the Scandinavian painting exhibition when they saw it in Boston, and began to sort of, again, understand that the Scandinavian works they were seeing confirmed directions they'd already begun to take, but created a kind of a new psychological realm within which they wished to work. The most immediate, enduring impact of the Scandinavian painting exhibition was on the group of 7 in Canada. And I'm showing you here on the right J.E.H. MacDonald's painting Snowbound from 1915, a painting that he himself said was indebted to and derived from works that he had seen in the Scandinavian exhibition of 1912, such as the Swedish artist Gustav Fjestad's Winter Moonlight scene from 1895. The group of the 7 established a kind of a landscape school of painting in Canada that more or less has endured throughout the 20th century, in which they did the thing that they saw the Scandinavians doing, and which we'll see now as we start to look at some paintings, which was to reach into a world of cosmopolitan avant-garde painting, new styles, new vocabularies, new color palettes that many of them had seen coming out of Paris and out of Weimar and out of other cities within Europe, that they took all of these new impulses, brought them back home, digested them, and then began to paint their own native landscapes using these new vocabularies. For the Canadians, such as MacDonald, works by Fjestad and his contemporaries in this mode were revelatory. So the show itself has had an afterlife, but we're not even aware of it. And one of the reasons we wanted to organize this exhibition was to bring back this lost moment in American art and cultural history. The exhibition was organized by Christian Brinton, and there's a photograph of the glowering Brinton sitting in a chair, photographed by Paul Haviland, one of the fine arts photographers who was part of Stieglitz's circle. Christian Brinton was a writer and a critic who was based between New York and Philadelphia, and who had organized a series of exhibitions in the early years of the 20th century, an exhibition of Spanish paintings, an exhibition of French paintings, and an exhibition of German paintings. And he had done such a good job in organizing these sort of national school groups that when the American Scandinavian Society determined that it wanted to organize a big exhibition of Scandinavian works to travel through the US, Christian Brinton was the obvious curator and organizer. Brinton came on board, and he helped to curate the show along with specialists from Scandinavia. And I'm showing you here the cover of the exhibition catalog, which was designed by the Art Nouveau, the Danish Art Nouveau artist Torvald Bindesbø. Christian Brinton organized the show with the help of 3 specialists from Scandinavia, whose names are listed on the first page of the 1912 catalog. Carl Madsen, who was at the time the director of the National Museum in Denmark. Jens Thies, who was the first director of the National Museum in Norway, and Carl Loren, a Swedish art historian and scholar. Those 3 scholars had collected works from throughout their homelands, and with the help of a Norwegian painter named Henrik Lund, had begun to amass this remarkable, unwieldy group of works of art to send to America, and then Brinton, here in New York, organized it. As Ed Gallagher said a moment ago, the exhibition wasn't just an exhibition of paintings and sculpture and tapestries to bring to New York. It wasn't just a survey of post-impressionist and, in fact, expressionist paintings, as you'll see, but it was also a kind of diplomatic coup, because it was the first time that the King of Sweden, the King of Denmark, and the King of Norway had grouped together to support an art exhibition. But it was also a period, as I'll talk in a moment, of political instability in the Scandinavian nations. So the 3 of them coming together for a joint project was something that was also quite remarkable, facilitated by the American Scandinavian Society. The exhibition, as it was conceived in 1912, was intended to showcase the work of 3 generations of artists in the 3 Scandinavian nations. The generation of the 1880s, and here Laurits Andersen Ring, in a painting, this is a pastel entitled Harvest, which is upstairs in the gallery, which you'll see. is a representative of this generation. And as you can note, his representation of rural labor is deeply indebted to the sort of luminous and sentimental work of Jean-François Millet in France, so I'm making that comparison there. In the 1880s generation, artists from the 3 Scandinavian countries, for various reasons, endeavored to modernize their art worlds and to establish independence in their art worlds. Many of them traveled to Paris or elsewhere in Europe to engage with the latest exhibited works and the latest techniques to study in the French Academy. And then some of them, in each of the 3 countries, organized breakaway groups. I'm showing you here a poster of the Free Exhibition, a Danish exhibition society that was founded in 1891. And I'm showing you here the exterior view of its building that was designed by one of the artists in our exhibition, Jens Ferdinand Wilhelmsen. These breakaway artist groups, very much like the Impressionists in Paris, organized themselves to control their markets as artists and to exhibit works that their home national academies would not exhibit themselves. The Free Exhibition in Copenhagen, for example, organized exhibitions of the works of the French Impressionists and Post-Impressionists, the works of Edvard Munch, and other radical artists from around Europe in order to create a more cosmopolitan art scene in Copenhagen. A similar thing happened in Norway and also in Sweden, with groups of artists opposing the old academic system and starting something fresh. The 1880s generation was represented in this 1912 exhibition, and so too is the 1890s generation, a generation of artists who emerged like Edvard Munch in this painting entitled Sick Child, from this one version from 1896, which was in the 1912 show. The 1890s generation represented a group of artists who were interested in psychology, who began to think that painting should be something that would represent one's interior thoughts and secret beliefs and secret dreams, and began to create paintings, as Munch did, that both blended what one could see in nature with the content of one's sentiment. In addition, the 1912, and I'm sorry, the artists of this generation were moved by new writings in psychology and in new kinds of literature that valued the inner life of people. For example, the writer Knut Hamsun, in which he said, I won't bother you with the entire quote, but more and more people, sensitive people living profound lives, often find themselves in a most unusual spiritual state of rapture. And he went on to say that these people in the modern world, living in modern cities, had begun to develop a kind of a hypersensitivity to the world, began to experience colors and sounds and sensations that previous generations never could. And he said in this essay entitled From the Modern Life of the Soul, which was translated and transmitted internationally in 1890 and the years that followed, that living in a city, living in the industrialized world, made you hyper-aware of your own interior being. And he called upon artists and poets to begin to express that interiority in their work. The 1890s generation did just that, and you'll see evidence of that upstairs. Finally, the 1912 exhibition included a range of artists, primarily these wild men from Norway, who began to take on and to absorb the works of, for example, Henri Matisse and Paul Cézanne and other, in particular, French artists from the turn of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And I'm showing you here a painting that's upstairs by Jean Heiberg from 1912, with its decorative background and its heightened colors. It's very much out of the palette of Henri Matisse. And as you'll see when you see the painting itself, in the way in which the body has been created through clustered brushstrokes is very much out of the sort of the game book of Paul Cézanne. The 3 generations of artists brought together for this exhibition therefore constituted what was called contemporary art at the time. And so the exhibition in 1912 was called contemporary, although many of the works in the exhibition looked back 20 years. But it was a kind of a blend of these generations of artists, all active at the time in the Scandinavian countries, and all of whom were in various ways competing in their styles and in their approaches to kind of take priority in their home countries. When we went to curate this exhibition, we made a decision not to try to reconstitute the 1912 show. It was huge, 165 works, and as you'll see, some of them were on a massive scale. But instead, we decided to pluck works that we could find and could identify from collections throughout the Nordic countries and from North America, and to try to bring in as many paintings as we could from the original exhibition. And this painting by Edvard Munch, Girl Under an Apple Tree from 1904, is one of them. You'll see it in the gallery, and then you can also see it, not as well in this slide as you will in a photograph that's up in the gallery as well. So we tried to find some of the works that were in the original show, and then what we also tried to do is find, when we couldn't get the works themselves because they'd been committed to other exhibitions, or for other reasons they weren't achievable for this show, we attempted to find works that would reflect them or that would have a relationship to them. This painting by the Danish artist Jens Ferdinand Wilhelmsen, entitled Woman Mountain Climber, from 1902 to 03, is one such painting. It's monumental in scale. It's tremendously keyed up color, and sort of pictorial strangeness is something that was remarkable for New York, for American critics. It's a painting that we couldn't achieve for this show, but we were able to borrow from a private collection Jens Ferdinand Wilhelmsen's gouache painting entitled Lady Mountain Climber from 1902, which at least somehow in memory brings us back to some of the paintings that were in the original show. And I'm showing you here an installation shot from Buffalo, which includes Wilhelmsen's original there. Some of the paintings that were in the 1912 exhibition were as large as 15 feet in length, and Jens Ferdinand Wilhelmsen's Son and Youth from 1909 to 1911 was one of them. And it's a painting that could have been available to us, but it was, for example, just extremely difficult to manage a painting of that scale to bring in here. In fact, the critics noted in the 1912 show that the Scandinavians were painting on this massive scale, painting images of their landscape on a massive scale, which, as I'll say in a moment, became an important part of the story of this show. Vilhelm Hammershøi was represented in, the Danish painter Vilhelm Hammershøi was represented by 11 canvases in the 1912 exhibition, and he was a sensation within this show. His near monochromatic, silent, geometrically organized paintings, such as this interior of a woman placing branches on a vase on a table, or the Church of St. Peter in Copenhagen, both of which are up in our current exhibition, represent a body of work that was in this show by Hammershøi. And this tiny little landscape, which you see, it's actually blown up huge on the screen here. I'm showing it to you because I want to show you details, which you may not be able to note instantly in the gallery. This little silent, rigorous painting by Vilhelm Hammershøi is also representative of that body of work that was in the 1912 show. And I'm comparing it here to another painting that you're going to see in the exhibition, a fjord scene by Laurits Andersen Ring. I just wanted to point out a few little details of these two paintings because you might walk by them without making note of the remarkable details within them. I want to point out that the Ring painting, which seems to be a kind of a landscape painting without incident, is actually a kind of a visual poem to the Danish countryside, which Ring was wont to do. It does represent the waters of the fjord reflecting the sky, and in the foreground there's a little bit of a rocky landscape and what seems to just be some grass. But if you look closely, you'll see that there have been excavations that have been done in the immediate foreground as people have been carving out little sections of bog to burn in their fireplaces. So it's a landscape that actually shows you something about labor and something about the daily rituals of the people who lived in this area, as well as, if you look in the distance, teeny tiny little minuscule habitations can be seen. And in addition, large stones that exist in these agricultural fields, rocks that have been there throughout the millennia that the farmers have had to move around. So there's a story of time and of history and of native rituals, local rituals, embedded in this landscape, easily recognizable to their audiences at the time. perhaps lost to us now, but I thought it was worth pointing out. And in the Hammershøi painting, again, both of these are the artists of sort of the cusp of the 1880s, 1890s generation. When you look carefully at this almost abstract little landscape, you'll note that the paint strokes in the foreground become flat and diffuse, so that the bottom part of the painting almost looks like a surface abstraction. And up above, just at the horizon line, there are tiny, tiny little habitations, a little windmill, and there's a larger view of it. A windmill and tiny little houses, all of them painted in a kind of a silvery tonality that's deeply indebted to the work, for example, of James McNeill Whistler. And many of the artists in this exhibition were consumers of international avant-garde art, such as the work of the American expatriate Whistler. And on the horizon line, in this tiny little painting by Hammershøi, is evidence of local hip-roofed architecture, which you can see almost in archaeological detail, but writ small. Details like that, which we might overlook now, were incredibly important to the audiences in Denmark of this period in the 1880s and the 1890s, because they spoke so strongly of home in a new kind of voice. And as I've mentioned before, Whistler was of immense importance to Vilhelm Hammershøi. He's best known for his interior scenes, often of his wife modeling in the apartments that they inhabited in Copenhagen. She's often seen from behind, often in silence. And it's the silence of these pictures and the austerity of these pictures and the geometric organization and the luminosity that penetrates them that galvanized critics at the turn of the 20th century, and now are galvanizing critics again as his reputation has gone up. An artist who was represented in the 1912 exhibition, who was the only woman exhibited in 1912, is the Swedish artist Anna Boberg. And this painting is upstairs, entitled Glacier. It's a relatively modest composition, painted in a quite wild, expressionist manner. And if you look closely at it, you'll see it's painted in a series of dissonant colors that vibrate as you look at it. Now, Boberg was of tremendous interest to New York critics. Because of, not only was she an adventuress, she was written about as an adventuress, she left her native Sweden and she moved up to the Lofoten Islands on the northern coast of Norway. And there she lived on and off for years, painting outdoors in the snow, as you see her self-represented here. This was a photograph that was included in the exhibition catalog. And the story of Boberg and other artists painting out in the snow, enduring the northern wilderness, was repeated again and again in the exhibition catalog of 1912 in a portrait of Bruno Liljefors, represented, and he's an artist you'll see in the exhibition upstairs. Gunnar Hallström, and on, one after another, these athletic Scandinavian skiers are represented in the catalog. And it's for that reason that this exhibition has another legacy, which is a more complicated one, which is that a lot of the critics at the time looked at the portraits of the artists, looked at this sincere work about landscape, and they began to write about ethnicity and virility. When this exhibition was received all over the United States, critics talked about how virile, how genuine, how primitive these artists were, and how pure they were. And of course, this was a time in the United States when a lot of immigrant groups had just recently taken hold. And so there's a certain amount of anxiety in some of the criticism about recent immigrant groups from the Mediterranean area or from Eastern Europe, and in contrast, the Scandinavians up in the north in the bright sunlight skiing would also potentially be bringing some purity into the American art scene. So that's part of the story of this exhibition, as the critics were telling it. But the important part about all these people skiing and painting outdoors, and in a portrait by Anders Zorn, which shows the open-air painter out in the snow, painting a scene right on the spot, the Scandinavians also demonstrated the thing that a lot of the members of the Stieglitz Circle and other Americans were hoping to achieve, which was direct painting outdoors on the spot, plein-air painting, which had been more or less pioneered in France, and which was a commonplace in Europe, but wasn't yet a commonplace here within American academic teaching. So the fact that these artists were outside, in the snow, seeing the world and representing it was something critical to American audiences, and also the reputations of the Scandinavian painters coalesced with that of the polar explorer Fridtjof Nansen. This is a portrait of Nansen on skis, and sort of songs about Nansen. The polar explorer Fridtjof Nansen, the great Norwegian explorer and later humanitarian, was also a kind of a folk hero here in the United States. So that when J. Nilsen Lauervik wrote his review of the Scandinavians as being so primitive, so primal, so pure, it's part of that arena of almost an ethnic discourse that got loaded onto this exhibition, and also referencing that world of Fridtjof Nansen and polar exploration in the far north. When we curated this exhibition, and I'm going to show a few more slides, and then I think we're best served by looking at the paintings themselves. But to say, when we curated this exhibition, we recognized that we could neither reconstitute the entire 1912 show, nor could we provide a survey of Scandinavian art from the turn of the century. That had already been done extraordinarily sensitively by Kirk Varnedoe in the Northern Light exhibition in the 1980s, and also by Roald Nasgård in the exhibition The Mystic North, which was held a long time ago in 1984 in Canada, but nonetheless they told their stories. The story that we wanted to tell instead was about this cultural moment, about the bringing to North America of these works and the impact that the works had and the way the critics received the works. When the show was organized in 1912, only the works of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark were included, because in 1912 those were the only sovereign sovereign nations in the north. But because Finland received its sovereignty in 1917, and Iceland finalizing its sovereignty in 1944, becoming therefore partners with the foundation, we decided to include Finland and Iceland in this exhibition so that the works of all 5 Nordic countries could be represented. And when you go upstairs, you'll recognize that we've organized 3 large galleries in the center of the exhibition to honor the original 3 countries that were part of the show. And we've created jewel boxes, we're sort of calling them jewel boxes, on either end of the exhibition, so that the works of Finnish artists such as Akseli Gallen-Kallela, in a view of into his dining room in the arts and crafts villa, home and studio that he built, which is entitled Kallela. I'm showing you a view of it here, can be included in our exhibition, as well as a portrait that Gallen-Kallela created of his wife, Mary Slud, during their honeymoon in the western part of Finland. Gallen-Kallela was one of the leading sort of nationalist painters in Finland at the turn of the century. And I'm showing you here a massive painting of his, a view of a waterfall at Montekoski, which is located also in an area of Finland toward the Russian border. And I'm showing it to you because to reinforce the fact that when Gallen-Kallela even painted sometimes the simplest landscape composition, or he designed his house based on indigenous Finnish forms, he did so to promote a notion of Finnishness, of a kind of a genuineness and attachment to his land. Finland at the time in the 1890s and through the early years of the 20th century was under a kind of a political threat from Russia, a Russification of Finland. And therefore the articulation of the Finnish landscape, Finnish waterfalls, Finnish architecture in the hands of Gallen-Kallela, and in this vast symbolist composition, a waterfall that has golden musical strings running through it, are all ways of poeticizing a sense of belonging, a claiming of place that was at the time under some threat. Likewise, when you go upstairs, you'll see the works of Icelandic painters, Thorarinn Thorlaksson's composition, Vita River from West Iceland from 1903, like Gallen-Kallella's view, seems to be at first a very simple landscape composition which dissolves before your eyes into this kind of silvery glow in the sky. And it's intentionally made by Thorlaksson, who was one of the 2 pioneers of modern art in Iceland at the turn of the century, as again a kind of a visual poem to the stasis and the quietude of the Icelandic landscape, seen at twilight with a little Icelandic horse in the middle ground here. It's a kind of a statement about indigenous life. And there's also, I'll point out again, a tiny little farmstead here on the left-hand side of the composition, which you may miss when you go by it. These details of tiny little houses, of vast landscapes, like Prince Eugen's After Rain from 1904, are intended to be spectacles, in a sense, reminders of a past, reminders of the enduring landscape as the artists themselves articulated them, the endurance of the land itself, the beauties of wilderness, and at the same time, the ephemerality of twilight, one of the things you'll see in quite a few of these paintings. This fusion of the enduring landscape and the endless vista of wilderness suggests perpetuity, and that was an important story, of course, in nation building at the time. And at the same time, this sense of the light that's shifting and changing, a moment in time, is something that renders these paintings and this approach to painting throughout the Nordic nations something that was a sensation for American critics and artists. The painter Harald Solberg from Norway included this painting in the 1906 exhibition entitled Fisherman's Cottage. And I fear that with all the lights on, it's greatly diminished in its intensity. It's one of the few paintings that was purchased directly from the exhibition and now hangs in the Art Institute of Chicago. And because of its fragility, it's a painting that we were able to reproduce in the catalog. But we've gotten one of the great masterpieces of turn-of-the-century Norwegian art in Harald Solberg's Flower Meadow in the North from 1905, which hangs upstairs, an unbelievable treasure. And in these landscapes, too, like Thorlaksson in Iceland and like Gallen-Kallela in Finland or like Prince Eugen in Sweden, Solberg was interested in trying to say something about the soul of the land, a sense of inner psychology and desire investing landscape with both a personal meaning and a collective meaning. In the years that this exhibition covers, therefore, there are works by students of Henri Matisse, there are followers of Cézanne, there are these soulful symbolist painters, and there are works by some radicals from the 1890s. One of them is Christian Krogh, who's got a small painting up in the exhibition, who were intent upon driving forward a kind of a socialist, liberationist agenda. In 1884, Krogh had painted this large narrative composition entitled Albertina in the Police Doctor's Waiting Room. It's a massive composition. It was not in the 1912 exhibition, but I want to make a statement by using it. It's a painting that is based on a novel that Krogh also had written, which was about the abuses that were faced by young girls who were forced into walking the streets because of various kinds of social biases against young women, against working women. It was a diatribe against class collisions at the time in Christiania, present-day Oslo. And it was an indictment against kind of middle-class morality, where young girls are, for various reasons, forced into street walking and then punished for it by society. I'm mentioning this because when one talks in the United States and internationally about artists who believe that there's a soul in the landscape and that one's folk soul emerges from the earth, one immediately starts to think about the German Romantic tradition and then the direction of the German Romantic tradition into the 20th century, into catastrophe. But within the Scandinavian nations, this love of landscape and this desire to engage with a past also coalesced with the progressive politics of these liberationist movements at the turn of the century and with the great nationalist movements that were moving forward into sort of the achievement of autonomy. There was a liberal, there was a kind of a political liberalism rather than a deep conservatism built into this notion of the land and landscape. In our exhibition, we were also able to exhibit this spectacular painting by Carl Larsson. And Larsson was someone who was known well here in the United States prior to the 1912 exhibition. He's of course the painter of unbelievably charming representations of Swedish home life, of his own home. He and his wife were also Art Nouveau designers, and they built and designed their own home to be a model home for other Swedes, so that it wasn't just landscape that was supposed to remind Swedes of their Swedishness, but it was the material culture of Sweden, the costumes, architectural design, and kind of the sense of a big national family coming together, all invested in a painting like this. And finally, as we organized this exhibition, we cheated a little bit. We cheated a lot with this exhibition, actually. I showed you earlier a kind of a Matisse-looking painting by Jean Heiberg, who was not in the original exhibition, but his work resonates with the intentions of the original curators, and we've tried to stay close to the original curators' tastes for each country. But we couldn't resist, and the Norwegian curators who worked with us couldn't resist, including this painting by Harriet Bakr, who you'll see upstairs. With the presence of Harriet Bakr in this exhibition, we've increased the number of women 200% from 1 to 2, which we were happy to do. There were remarkable women who were professional painters and who were players on the Scandinavian art scene at the turn of the century. Harriet Bakr in this magnificently rendered, brightly colored, loosely achieved representation of a woman laboring at sewing near a window, was someone who was not only one of Norway's leading painters, but she was an organization builder. She was a mentor to most of the artists from Norway included in our exhibition upstairs, and a tastemaker. And she was also consulted in the organization of this exhibition, so we cheated a little and we included her in the show. And finally, as I said before, we cheated by broadening out some of the Norwegian inclusions, in particular Henrik Sørensen, whose painting is dead here on the screen, but is spectacular up in the gallery, was one of the most radical painters in Norway in the years prior to 1912. This painting called Svartbekken, which may refer to the identity of a criminal who may or may not be represented seated in front of a campfire, a bonfire in the middle of the forest, represents the new directions that were emerging in Scandinavia around this time toward a radical expressionism, and we wanted to at least include some of that work in the show. As I said at the outset, the show is received remarkably well by critics and by the public alike, and we hope that it opens up investigation into this exhibition as a source for some American art. And I wanted to end with this comparison of a landscape painting by Vilhelm Hammershøi, of a simple abstracted scene with light flowing through trees and almost turning them into these kind of areolas or explosions of dissolving light. Works like this, works in the show, only already confirmed directions, as I said before, that American artists were already taking. And this is a photograph by Edvard Steichen, a member of Stieglitz's circle, entitled The Pond, which was taken just after the turn of the century. When Steichen and Stieglitz's circle and Marsden Hartley and the Canadian painters and the painters in Gloucester and many others saw these paintings, and they looked sincere, and they were kind of wild looking, and they were experimental, and yet they showed the land and the people closest to the artists. American artists such as Steichen and his colleagues believed they'd actually found a potential path on which they could then move into the 20th century. So even though the show disappeared under the weight of the 1,300 works in the Armory show, we're delighted to be able to resurrect a memory of the Scandinavian Art Exhibition, and we now invite you up into the galleries. Thank you very much for your patience.